All right, Dr. Collins back on behalf of the Advanced Orthogonal Institute. And today, it's dimensional transpositioning. Radiographic cross-referencing, but dimensional transpositioning sounds so much cooler. So, on principle, one of the really cool things that you can do when you take all of your x-rays at 46 inches, which is what advanced orthogonal does, is you can reference different images to draw information out for the anatomical reference you're trying to mark. But basically, you can cross-reference other images. So I've got my trusty notes here just to help keep me on track. But we'll start off with the frontal film. It can be not so easy to figure out where in the heck a C2 spinous process is. And sometimes it can be not so easy to figure out where the lateral margins of the C7 body are. So, one of the things you can do is utilize, in terms of the C2 spinous process tip, you can utilize your trusty sagittal view to get it done. So, I'll show you what I'm talking about here. If you can imagine, you have several different very interesting relationships here. If I'm at that 11-degree S line, right, I can also mark where the odontoid meets the body, right? And I can also reference where that spinous process tip is. Now, it just so happens on this young lady, right, her posterior arch and spinous process are basically superimposed. So it makes it really easy. But if you could imagine, right, let's say anatomically, I'll kind of drag these lines out to make this make more sense. But, right, let's say, just hypothetically, that her spinous process was actually down here, right? This lower one. You could measure from that posterior arch on your sagittal film, right? And have that measurement that you could drag over to your frontal film. Now, this is not going to be accurate, but just by way of example, if I know where her posterior arch is, right, if I can see that on this film, then I could measure down to get the height S to I, right, which for hers was like 12 on her hypothetical one. So in terms of getting the height of the spinous location, I'm halfway there if I get the height, right? For her, I already know hers are superimposed, right, when we did this, not the hypothetical one. I know her C2 spinous process is, basically where her posterior arch is. So that's where I would be looking, and I did when I analyzed her films. I was right in here. Okay, so I know right around this little zone in terms of height, right? I'm not looking up above for a C2 spinous tip, and I'm not looking below. I want to be right around where that posterior arch is. And so for me, right, I put a dot right here. That's my dot. Now, what about rotationally? How do you figure out right to left where that C2 spinous is? Well, now you can do dimensional transpositioning using your trusty axial view, assuming it's not rotated, right? If I were to drop a midpoint, boom, again, at the base of that odontoid, now, look at that. Look at what I got a trusty midline that it drops right for me. And look at what I can see. I can see that C2 spinous tip. So if I want to be super fancy, I can even measure off of that. Bang, right? About 1 millimeter to the right. So, same kind of a thing. You get the idea here, though. Isn't this awesome? This is so nice. Instead of just trying to fish around and hallucinate where it should be, all you have to do is measure. So you should be right around there somewhere. And if you're rotated a little bit on one of those films, you can, adjust slightly. But you didn't take a look at that. See, you can see that spinous tip right there. It just comes out of the woodwork for you. Perfect. Thank you, dimensional transpositioning. Okay, so moving on. Jeez, I'm all over the place. All right, zoom out. Okay, so the lateral margins of the C7 body. This is another one where your axial view is going to be your friend. And dimensional transpositioning. See how many times I can say that in one video. But typically on the axial view, on the axial film, you're going to notice that the lateral margins of the bodies are much cleaner. So if you wanted to measure, a lot easier, right? Typically. Hers are not bad. So her frontal film is just about as clean as her axial. But sometimes, especially as that S line starts to get, more angle on it, all of a sudden, you might have a washed out, lower cervical spine. So something you can do is measure the axial view because you can see them so clean. And now from end to end, you should be around 49 or 50. And again, everybody's taking it 46. So this should look similar. And if you're too washed out in AdvO in terms of your cervical spine angle, you're going to be taking an S2 at 10 anyway. So it's not going to be too crazy looking, right? So now, once you have that measurement, you can kind of locate very easily. Mark the lateral margins of your C7 body. Okay. Moving on. See here. Horizontal film. Okay. So when you're trying to mark your atlas plane on the horizontal film, you're going by majority rules, right? So that was the last video we just did, was how to analyze that horizontal film. Well, how do you figure out exactly where the inferior, right? Once you've been doing this for a while, it's easier, is where that superior mass sits, right? How do you generate that if you can't see it well? Well, you can cross-reference your sagittal film. And for the best example, I actually wanted to pull out the PowerPoints because I thought it really shows it well. So when you're looking at the atlas from the frontal plane, right, you'll see, this will be mildly confusing, but in red, you're going to see what is representative of those transverse foramen where the arteries running through. You're going to see blue margins. That's going to be that superior mass. And then you're going to see the green margins. That's going to be that inferior mass. So you can get a view from the frontal film in terms of dimensional transpositioning that you can kind of drag down into your, with even, measuring. You can measure those distances when it comes time to, from a medial to lateral aspect, where are my superior and inferior masses relative to each other and the transverse foramen, which is incredibly valuable, right? Because sometimes a horizontal film can be tough. And then in terms of sort of S to I, right? Like how far south is that mass relative, superior mass relative to the inferior mass? I mentioned this on the last video, but again, you're taking your horizontal film at an angle, right? So if you were to take and, it's represented here as that black line in that top picture in the middle. You'll see that black line is going to be the, as long as I'm on the plane of that central ray, right? That superior mass is going to sit just posterior to that green line, is what you're going to see is going to be that inferior mass margin. So using the sagittal film, you could even measure one relative to the other. If you're just struggling and you're having a hard time, you could drop and figure out the millimeters from one to the other that should land you where you need to be so that you can draw your plane line for your atlas ultimately your majority rules, but your various plane lines to derive your majority rules. Hopefully that was helpful. I think conceptually that can get lost. But all right, last is going to be maybe the most important. Different people could argue. But when it comes to adjusting somebody, you want to make sure you're actually aiming at what you're supposed to be aiming at. And when we're talking about the aiming for AdvO, we're aiming at the transverse process. But sometimes it's not so easy to figure out where the transverse process is. One, you should be trying to figure out where the transverse process is. It's not just in the tragus notch, but how do you figure out where that is, right? Because you have the dens here, and it can be very easy, right? You have a lot of structures going on here. It can be very easy to not be able to visualize properly. Let me flip that. I'm just used to looking at them this way. That transverse process, and you got two of them. You got a right and a left. So depending on what their listing is, right? Let's say she's a right. Okay. How do you figure out which one of the transverse processes, assuming you can make them out, you're even supposed to be aiming at? So I need to figure out in terms of S to I, which transverse process is going to be one higher than the other, which one's the right one, the correct one, but also the right one is the correct one, we're going to say hypothetically. And then in terms of S to I, so if there's two transverse processes and one is anterior and one is posterior, which one's the correct one? So one, we'll go to her horizontal view to figure out A to P, right? So if I have her measurement and I know her atlas is anterior on the right, okay, I know that if I can measure two of these guys, or where I should be looking for one that's anterior. Okay? Makes sense. Secondly, in terms of S to I, where are her transverse processes relative to her atlas frontal plane? Okay, so if I go along her posterior arch here, do her transverse processes sit above her atlas frontal plane? Or, you're going to think I'm joking, but people have gnarly looking transverse processes. Or does it sit below? Right? Also, does one sit below and the other sit above? What is this person's situation, right? So I know where to be looking for the right transverse process. So we're going to draw hers back out was. Hers both sit above, basically that atlas frontal plane. And then also, relative to the skull, the atlas on the right, transverse process that we're supposed to be mapping out where it's at, relative to the skull, so with the atlas frontal plane, and then I just did a little 90-degree angle here based on that frontal cephalic line, right? Maybe a touch lower relative to the skull. So that when I'm looking on the sagittal film, right, I know, should I be low or high? Right, I know I should be anterior, and based on that, either level or just a touch low. So then when I come in here and I start trying to map, right, if I get one here, I get one here, and then I know I want the one that's slightly more anterior, right? Bang. In terms of mapping the transverse process. And you can do that because you have dimensional transpositioning. Lastly, you can look at the mastoid height, right? So I know I got a gazillion lines going on here. But part of the adjustment in AdvO, right, is going to be the height of the mastoids. If we're adjusting her on the right side, right? If you are mapping those mastoids, are they level relative to the skull, or is one higher or lower? And again, with that frontal cephalic line, which I just erased, but just by way of example, right? Let's say you had a frontal cephalic line and then you do that 90. Do I have a mastoid that's higher or lower? Because when I come back over to this view on the sagittal, right? I need to map out that mastoid process, and if I have two of them, which one's higher, which one's lower, right? So if just by way of example, I have the one, and then I have another, if I know, based on our frontal film, then I need to leave the one that's lower relative to the skull, assuming I don't have tilt in this view, right? I have superimposed mandibles. That skull is level on my film. I'm going to go ahead and allow that lower one to remain. And now I'm going to be adjusting this young lady accurately because I have the correct mastoid and I have the correct transverse process. So I hope that helps. I know that's a little bit technical and I moved a little quick, but it's a lot of, a few different components of dimensional transpositioning. But if you have any questions, leave a comment, like these posts. Also, I know I always talk about the boot camp, but if you're looking for an internship or to get certified, right? If you are curious about that, that's something I haven't shared in one of these videos, is we do offer internships and we do offer certification in advanced ortho. So hit us up. Talk to one of these gentlemen on the board, right? But I'm sure one of us will be able to host you at an internship. And certainly we can get you certified in the work. But other than that, I hope this video was informational and helpful for you. Try some of these tools on your next analysis session. And God bless. Have a great day.